All right. Thank you, Jim. That was absolutely wonderful. Thank you for that fantastic keynote. So I'm going to go ahead and moderate the Q&A for the questions you've got. And thank you again as well, Patrice, for introducing as well. So go ahead and list your names. Okay, I'm going to go to everyone, and we'll call on folks in order. If you're feeling shy as well, feel free to write out your question in the chat too. But yeah, or you can raise your hand if you're having trouble with the chat as well. I've got my eye on everyone. Go ahead, Jim.
Hi, Jim. Thanks so much. That was fantastic. I really enjoyed that. And you know, I have so many questions, but I'll start with this one, which is a little bit convoluted. But so, as you noted, Margaret is such a different character in Richard III than she is in the earlier plays. You know, she haunts the play. You cited Ronfin as she's the political unconscious of the play, right? And there's a way in which she's kind of a principle of historicity in Richard III in that play. And she's also this figure of immense grief, right? And I guess, you know, I wondered about this particular adaptation and Margaret as a figure of grief. That alliance of women you talk about is an alliance of grief, and it's a very self-conscious grief, right? You could talk in that scene, we see grief being weaponized in a way, in a really interesting way. It's, you know, I was also thinking about Prestige TV, and it's kind of commonplace observation that Prestige TV sort of, I don't know, makes a fetish of grief, or at least the kind of, this is probably an overly simplistic critique of Prestige TV, but the critique goes that it sort of deploys grief for a certain kind of gravitas, for the, you know, the prestige, right? So I was just wondering about, you know, this as an example of Prestige TV in relation to the ways in which grief has been deployed and the critique that is out there about that deployment of grief, and how that fits into this play that really is, you know, fundamentally, I think, you know, about what happens, you know, in war, in the aftermath of war, with all of these, you know, all of these dead sons they keep sort of reciting the names of throughout. And in any case, there's a question in there somewhere.
Yeah, no, well, thank you very much, Jim, for that really helpful observation. I mean, of course, I'm reminded of the fact that we're seeing this playing out in our current affairs today with the very tragic situation in Europe. And I think you're quite right. I mean, to me, the plays, I quite liked the depiction of them as sort of a mess of barons. I mean, obviously the plays at early works, there's arguably, I mean, some editors have argued that they're potentially collaborated on in the earlier iterations of them. And I think one of the things about Henry VI in particular is there are lots of different stories you can choose from to adapt for screen. And what we do as adapters, I'm speaking here as a creative that specializes in adaptation, I suppose more from a practitioner side here, is you need to try and find, as Ben said, the truth or the thread that you want to focus on. You make it, in a way, it's a very similar process to doing literary criticism. You choose what you want to focus on, and then you're interpreting it creatively rather than in a critical standpoint. So I think that grief certainly forms a very clear thread through this play. There's interesting scholarship that's been done in queenship studies about how anger and grief are weaponized, as you mentioned. And I think that ultimately that's one of the things that elevates these plays to me is the fact that behind them is this very real a quality we can really empathize with, is that you've got people losing members of their family, which is ultimately what weaponizes that wonderful scene of alliance between the Duchess and Margaret and Elizabeth in Act 4, Scene 4 there. With respect to the use of grief in prestige television, I agree with you. My work always tends to, I don't know, so as a screenwriter, as an executive producer in television, I resist that. I agree with you. I think that too often it's sort of, let's do some misery and that'll get us awards. And if you look at, I mean, in film, for example, it's very rare to see a comedy awarded an Academy Award for Best Picture, although it does happen. So there's this semblance that, this sense that drama is inherently more literary or high quality than comedy can ever be, and that realist drama is inherently more valuable than any genre drama. Again, something I would push back at. And so consequently, it's sort of an easier territory to take when you're trying to do prestige TV. I like shows that blur the boundaries, like Killing Eve and Fleabag, for example, where there's a strong comic edge to them as well. So I think that certainly it's very interesting that you raise that, I suppose, substantive trend of prestige or complex television and how it fits into that. And I think that's probably true. I mean, in addition to the fact that obviously this is a BBC adaptation, the first ones took place during 2012, during the London Olympics, and there's scholarship about the sort of role in sort of nation building and whatnot there. I certainly think that in addition to being, I suppose, prestige cultural products of England, there is that sense that they fit naturally into the form of prestige TV. As we continue to have debates over what's TV and what's film, it becomes more blurry. And indeed, this was a question that Ben and I raised: what are these things? And can we even talk about a distinction of television anymore? So I suppose in a roundabout way, my answer to your question is I think that grief's a really important thread within those stories. And when we're looking as practically as adapters at what we're going to draw as through lines, it forms a really useful one that helps us to empathize as an audience member with these events of politics that happened so long ago, but also one that perhaps helps, practically speaking, to get it commissioned and funded with Amazon money, because it fits nicely into their sort of brand space in that sense. So thank you. I really appreciate that question.
Thank you, Jim. Andrew?
Hey, Jim. Like Jim, I love the paper. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
And I love the production and I love the plays. So this is definitely in my wheelhouse. And in my wheelhouse is very much my question: what's Margaret? Because I really have a difficult time telling, especially in a production like this, where she's variously, like Jim says, say a principle of history, but also she's psychologized. Also, she's this mother figure. I mean, is she a ghost? All of these questions about, I guess, the ontology of ghosts and just Margaret herself. And just a second thing, there was a production of Richard III at the London Olympia. There was the Chinese Beijing opera production.
Right, well, yeah.
Where Margaret is just on stage the entire time, standing at the back on a scaffold with the names of everyone who will die in the play hung down, and she just pours blood down their name when they die. So there we can see wonderful. Something like this externalization of some historical force, right? Something perhaps more closer to fate than historical necessity. So I'm wondering what she is, and if that question is itself naive, and if it's not naive, how do we think about the logic of representation?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I think it comes down to, in part, and I'm reticent to dig too far into the writing history of the plays just because there's so much that we don't know. But I think what we could say is a broadly accepted scholarly consensus is that the plays were not written in a chronological order and that they were potentially written by collaboration, which to me, I mean, just a sidebar, working in the industry on a day-to-day, we have incredibly tight deadlines. We have a 6-week script deadline. They had a 6-week script deadline. We have to submit a plot. Before we write script, they had to submit a plot. The pay structure is similar. The pace is similar. The competition is similar. So a lot of discussion about the grand designs of these great things. Sometimes they're just you kind of throwing things together in the moment, and sometimes magic comes out of it. And I suppose my gut feeling about the plays is, I think there's probably an element of there wasn't a great overarching sort of grand scheme of literary invention that it was, they did 2 plays that worked quite well. They went back and wrote the prequel and they sort of cobbled together as best they can. As I say, I'm qualifying that heavily with that's my instinct as a practitioner rather than my proved position as a scholar. But I think that as a consequence of that, you do have patchiness in characterization, and that's particularly seen in Richard's character through Henry VI, was something that I think that the adaptation deals with quite well by giving him a more cohesive character arc. What I think is really interesting about the plays is in the early 2000s in particular, we had the Difficult Men sort of decade of prestige or quality television with Tony Soprano and Walter White, for example, where there was a long form narrative study of the life of a difficult man from sort of the start to the end of it. And here what we see, I think, in similar form is that study of a female heroine. What I find so fascinating is I think, and I'd love to be corrected on this, I think she's the only female character of Shakespeare is to kill in a battle as a leader of troops. And to me, that's really fascinating that you've got that character there who hasn't been seen as much. So I think on the one hand, she is a political operator. On the other hand, she's a general, and on a third hand, she's a grieving mother. I don't think she's grieving much for Henry VI, but she's certainly grieving for Suffolk or Somerset in this adaptation. And then at the end, she seems to be a ghost. And to pick up on your question about the ontology of Margaret, it's really interesting, isn't it? I'm fascinated by the weird sisters in Macbeth. I'm fascinated by what Margaret is at the end of it. And I don't know. And that's why I talked about her as a clearly embodied presence and also an hallucination. My supposition is that Margaret is probably a hallucination of Richard's and a manifestation of his guilty conscience. But I think the stage device, thinking through it on the fly, that's being used is a haunting to reveal that. And I think that, you know, there's been some interesting work. Obviously, it's anachronistic to apply the Gothic to Shakespeare directly, but there's been some interesting work by Gothic horror scholars looking at this and the way that you see emotional trauma manifest in the Gothic genre through hauntings and monsters. I mean, in a completely different genre space, Buffy, for example, did it really well with teenage drama being manifested as literal monsters. But, you know, here you've got a sense of her as almost the Furies or fate, or, you know, the weird sisters coming back to haunt him, his bad deeds coming back to physically haunt him. And I think that there is a combination of her as being both a mental hallucination, whether she's an actual embodied spirit, I don't know. But I think that what the feature film adaptation is using is embracing the fact that we've got a visual medium and using a manifested form of her. I think that the way the narration works in that scene clearly brings us into his mental subjectivity, which is what lends me to think that on the face of it, she's an hallucination. You see, when Richard is being affected by Margaret, we have like canted angles, right? So the angles are tilted, which is a particular technique. You see there in the dream sequence, you get this wonderful blurring of the outsides of the images. I mean, to me, it draws from the genre conventions of Gothic horror cinema in that nightmare sequence, which also perhaps helps to, I don't know, consider it too. And the final point that I'll make, and sorry, I know that I'm sort of skipping around a little bit here, is that it was really interesting to me to see how The Haunting of Bly Manor, Mike Flanagan's second series of the Haunting of Hill House series, looked at the idea of death and hell as being in a house where you could never escape, where there was a collapsing of spatial integrity and also a collapsing of linear time. And to me, I found that interesting in this scene because you've got that collapsing of spatial integrity in the nightmare sequence that kind of draws a similar parallel to that. Anyway, that's a sort of my thoughts on the fly about it, but it's a fascinating question. I really appreciate you raising it.
Thank you
I'm
very
really
much.
interested to hear what you think about it.
No idea.
That's a good scholarly position, though. I mean, that's what Aristotle came to, right? Like, having considered all the evidence, yeah, I don't know. That's my informed position. But hopefully there's a paper in it somewhere.
Thank you, Andrew. Are there any other questions? While folks are still formulating, I'll jump in and ask mine. One that's kind of been a through line through today and through yesterday was thinking about remediation and looking for things and past work and sort of thinking through this adaptation as sort of taking Richard III and sort of female centering it. So I kind of want to get your sort of thoughts on that and with what's happening in modern adaptations of Shakespeare. But also what I think is interesting about this adaptation is Queen Margaret is in that play and she is sort of haunting it. And when she comes in, she's actually sort of in the perimeter of the room where people are talking. She's lurking right from the start. And so also kind of thinking through these new adaptations and them kind of also being a recovery of some of the things that are in these plays as well that have, like you've been saying, been lost or cut from so many adaptations over the years and performances. So yeah, just kind of wanted to get some of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. Thank you for that, Nicole. I think remediation is a really good word for it. I mean, as we say, the adaptation history of it has done the opposite, and it's privileged male characters. And so what we see both here and also the 25 recent various individual adaptations that foreground Margaret as a character and perhaps looser adaptations of the plays is an attempt to remediate there. I think that on one level, metaphorically, I always see Margaret as she's an unfinished story thread. They've sort of got rid of her and then she's come back. And in the same way that practically and politically she remains a problem for Richard, she's similarly an untied story in the narrative. And so sort of on, I suppose, a meta-theatrical or a metaphorical level, she's an unresolved serial story. I think that in terms of remediation, speaking, I suppose, taking off my academic hat, putting on my practitioner's hat, there is a long overdue and as yet not in any way perfect move towards increasing diversity and inclusion in television and film. It's still a problem. The industry is systemically misogynist, it's systemically white. But there is a very strong movement, both from what audiences expect and commercially, to ensure that television in particular is diverse in its writers' rooms, in its key creative teams, and in its casting, which is something I think they did very effectively in the casting, which was, I mean, Sophie Okonedo is just staggeringly good in that role. And so I think there is an industry and commercial pressure towards remediation in terms of diversity. And there is a pressure, this is something that I sort of wrote about in 2015 when I first sort of wrote about complex TV, was how could we say this is the golden age of television when it's all about men and there's no male creators? And I appreciate, obviously, I'm speaking as a cisgendered, straight man who doesn't have that lived experience. But I've experienced in my own personal career the challenges of trying to achieve diversity in rooms. I mean, for me, I don't think I've ever hired a male writer. I always only try to hire female writers because I believe that I'm in a position of seniority in the industry because of systemic injustices that have privileged me as a well-educated white guy. And I think that the only thing we can do is to try wherever we can. I mean, obviously in an imperfect way, I certainly don't have all the answers, is to try and remedy that. And I think it's really important. I mean, to me, it's a no-brainer. It's really important on a moral level, obviously, to include everyone, but it's also really important on a narrative level because we lose stories. We don't have nearly enough stories on screen about LGBTQI love stories, for example. Love, Simon was a notable example. There just aren't those stories. How are we reflecting ourselves back through art if we're just leaving out whole segments of lived experience? And of course, my demographic has been massively overrepresented. And I think that the female characters in Shakespeare fascinate me. And they fascinate me in part because they have been so neglected in the performance history. There's so much we've lost. I mean, just the fact that why is Queen Margaret not considered in the same breath as Richard III or for example, as Macbeth? She's got 4 plays, but she was absent from the stage for 350 years. So for me, that remediation is wonderful because, with this, we all know there's so much of Shakespeare already chewed over both in criticism and performance. And this is a really interesting approach to remediate and rehabilitate some of these stories that have been pushed to the side. But I think, fundamentally, moving aside from the artistic and the commercial reasoning, just on an industry level, it would be impossible these days to try and get up a prestige show like this that was a boy's own war story. That was certainly demonstrated in the slightly patchier first season of The Hollow Crown. I said patchy only because I think that there was less of a cohesive artistic approach to it. But there was a wonderful Henry V, which similarly looked at the historically very male plays through a female lens. And I mean, just speaking from my own experience as a creator who specializes in adaptations on the 2 shows I'm currently have the good fortune to helm, they're both shows that had a male-dominated key team of characters. One's a detective show set in apartheid South Africa, and one's an adaptation of a well-known piece of 19th century intellectual property. And in each, I've argued for and put a female lead in because otherwise you're leaving out half the stories, you're leaving out half the audiences. And I think that particularly in history, it's really challenging because there has been a male-dominated view of history. I'm saying a truism here, and a very white nationalist interpretation of history at times. And we see that in our historical drama. And I think that's a real problem. because of course the historical record shows us the opposite, that there were all sorts of interesting characters who were people of color and fascinating female characters. So I think that when you're doing historical drama, and in particular historical drama that forms, as Shakespeare's tetralogy does, such an iconic part of building the image of a nation and a culture, I think, you know, most of us, I mean, a lot of us have our idea of English history from the plays. It's incumbent upon you. I think you have a greater moral responsibility as a storyteller to try to embrace diversity wherever you can. So that, I mean, that's my perspective on it from, I suppose, an academic and a creative standpoint.
Oh, thank you. That was really helpful, especially from, yeah, that academic and also being a practitioner, being someone who does write for the screen. So that's really helpful. That's very interesting. Thank you. Are there any further questions? We've got about 7 minutes still before the break. We can break a little early, but there's also time. So. Okay. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and we'll take a break just a little bit early, and we will return at 3:45 for the roundtable lightning round. Thank you again so much for that wonderful keynote, Jim. And I will see you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening and for having me. I really appreciate it.
And finally, today we're going to hear from Martina Giuzzetti, who's a PhD student at the University of Milan. She's currently working on the language of early 20th century British feminist periodicals, but she's also interested in the early modern and the Victorian periods. Her main research interests focus on language and gender studies, obviously, which she explores in a diachronic perspective in the field of English lexicography too. So what I'd like to do today, I'd like to go through in that order, if no one minds, and then we will wait until the end. And first of all, we'll allow the speakers to respond to one another, and then I'll open up the floor to the attendees so we can all contribute our own in this, the final panel of our EMC conference. So Yafit, if you could start, that would be great.
Yes, thank you very much. Just a second, please. Yeah. Can you all see the presentation? Okay. Good. So I think I'm going to start. So throughout European history, queens in positions of power were perceived as women who interrupted or disrupted normal monarchy. Most disruptive of all was England's Elizabeth, whose reluctance to marry or fulfill her reproduction function imperiled the Tudor line. Today I'm going to talk about the Queen Elizabeth's marriage speeches. These are in fact 5 responses to petitions sent by her parliament in the first decade of her reign, urging her to marry and produce an heir. These speeches, as I argue, reveal a sophisticated rhetorical technique which, in appearing to touch on the matter of marriage and succession on the human and political level, finally shows these dimensions to be irrelevant on the metaphysical level of the spirit or the soul. Elizabeth resists and challenges the gender prejudice of her day by invoking new Platonic tropes that privilege the spirit over the body within a metaphorical discourse of ascent, rendering her lower embodied gender irrelevant to her elevated position and thereby placing emphasis on her transcendent intellect, abilities and skills required for a prince. At the age of 12, Elizabeth wrote to her father, quote, "As an immortal soul is superior to a mortal body, so whoever is wise judges things done by the soul more to be esteemed and worthy of greater praise than any act of the body." End quote. This thinking has guided her when she became queen as well, as she says in one of her written prayers, quote, "Managing the commonwealth so that the soul may rule the flesh, reason the soul, faith the reason." After her coronation, Elizabeth states in her first speech that she is, quote, "one body naturally considered, though by his permission, a body politic to govern," end quote, referring to the well-known King's two bodies theory. She goes on, which differentiates the monarch's natural body from the political body. She goes on to declare that she, with her ruling, and her nobles, with their service, will make a good account to Almighty God, making clear her determination to rule the kingdom by herself. In her next speech from 1559, she would famously suggest that she will die a virgin, but also promises that the kingdom will not be destitute of an heir. In 1563, her parliament was again determined to receive answers. And in a long and tedious petition, they demanded that the queen take herself some honorable husband and produce an heir for the kingdom, repeating such phrases as issue of your body and heir of your body, which imply of a reversed King's two bodies concept. Instead of having the political body substitute the natural body, the human female body literally becomes the vehicle through which the body politic helps to ensure its future operation. However, the more the parliament attempted to claim ownership on the queen's body, the more Elizabeth pushed for an intangible perception of her body that will liberate her from the obligation of a female body. Elizabeth responded to this petition in a highly rhetorical speech, quote, "The princely seat and kingly throne wherein God has constituted me makes these two causes to seem little in my eyes, though grievous perhaps to your ears, emboldened me to say somewhat in this matter, which I mean only to touch, but not presently to answer." End quote. Throughout her speech, she repeats the word matter 10 times in close succession without specifying what this matter is about. Elizabeth's frequent repetition of the word matter, alongside words such as weight, deep, and especially touch, implies that she views her petitioner's bid to force the issue of marriage as an attempt to drag her down to matter level in the metaphysical sense. Elizabeth then continues with, quote, "I trust you likewise do not forget that by me you were delivered whilst you were hanging on the bough, ready to fall into the mud, yeah, to be drowned in the dunk." End quote. Again, she's attempting to translate a political situation into a metaphysical one. While they were hanging in an in-between state, she was the one who saved them in England. This concept of the fall here is especially significant given its obvious theological resonance. They are bound to fall or be in a near fall state if they continue to force the issue of her marriage and confine her to her feminine body. Instead, Elizabeth insists in numerous speeches that she serves as a head to her subjects. In Elizabeth's response to the joint delegation from 1566, she says, quote, "A strange thing that the foot should direct the head in so weighty a cause," end quote. Here, as elsewhere in her political speeches, Elizabeth uses the metaphor of the realm of a single body while building the image through a frequent use of synecdoche. She is the head of the kingdom, the seat of all reason and logic, while her parliament and subjects are the feet that must obey the rational dictates of the head in order to avoid a further slip or fall. Elizabeth ultimately ungenders the monarchical position and mystifies her bodily presence as a way of highlighting her transcendental virtues as God's anointed. That is, her knowledge, skills, and leadership qualities. Doing so, she manages to create a political space for herself, a single and singular female monarch. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yafit. Now I would like to ask Lydia if she could read for us.
Yeah, definitely. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking about Mary Sidney and her translations of the Psalms of David. So I'm going to get started for us. So in Mary Sidney's translations of the various Psalms of David, the Countess conveyed both religious and feminist ideals. Her translation work actually began after a number of great tragedies occurred in her immediate family. So in her early 20s, she lost her daughter, her father, and her mother all in quick succession, and then received word that her famous brother, Philip Sidney, had also died, and he was fighting for the Protestant cause in the Netherlands. So she was overwhelmed by grief, and she mourned at her Wiltshire estates for 2 years. And then in November 1588, she went to London and actually returned to London in order to honor her brother's memory by assuming his translations of the Psalms of David. So since she couldn't fight for the Protestant cause with a sword, she used her pen in order to promote the Protestant cause. So her entrance into the literary world really shows her as loyal to both the earthly and heavenly realms. It was really fueled by her love for her deceased brother and his legacy, and her desire to honor and please the Protestant Queen Elizabeth. And all of that combined with her love of Jesus Christ and the Word of God. So these groundbreaking translations were prepared for presentation to the Queen in 1599. Accompanying this presentation copy were 2 dedicatory poems. Both were composed by the Countess, one to Queen Elizabeth and the other to the spirit of her deceased brother, Philip Sidney. By continuing Philip's religious translations and dedicating them to both him and Queen Elizabeth, Mary Sidney herself, by remaining within established social limits, became the most important woman writer and patron of the Elizabethan period. She was one who demonstrated what could and what could not be accomplished in the margins of being a woman at that time. And by astute use of these permitted religious genres, she made a strong political and feminist statement to the best of her ability within those margins. So her translations of the Psalms proved to not only be a literary feat, but a religious, political, and feminist statement in a very rigid patriarchal society. As a member of the upper echelon of British society, she had plenty examples of the political uses of the Psalter or Psalm writer close at hand. Her Dudley uncles had produced examples of the political uses of these Psalms during their imprisonment in connection with their father's attempt to put Protestant Lady Jane Grey on the throne of England. Sidney understood quite profoundly the importance of Protestantism and Reformation politics within her family circle, and she witnessed the often tumultuous state of the British monarchy. So with the peaceful rule of Protestant Queen Elizabeth beginning in November 1558, the members of the Sidney family, especially by the time Mary began her translations in 1588, were able to sit far more comfortably in their Protestant faith. However, those tensions between Catholics and Protestants were far from over, and that's a reality that Mary Sidney did not overlook while she was crafting her translations. The translated Psalms are filled with a lot of blessings and thanks to Elizabeth's benevolent rule, and they embody a female literary strategy through which women could be represented as heroic without directly challenging the patriarchal culture of Elizabethan England. So by placing a religious work into the Queen's hands, Sidney asserted female power under God himself, which fit very snugly into those nearly unbreakable patriarchal structures of the time. So she weaved through really strict social and literary barriers through her devotion to both Christ and the Queen. And in order to support both the divinely inspired Queen and Jesus, and her brother, Sidney combines a lot of political and religious imagery when she translates the Psalms of David. And I wanted to read you her translation, a very brief excerpt from Psalm 45. This one has a lot of imagery, and then I'm going to compare it to the King James Version, which was written 20 years later. So this excerpt says, "This queen that can the king her father call, doth only she in upper garment shine, nay, underclothes, and what she weareth all. Gold is the stuff, the fashion art divine, brought to the king in robe embroidered fine." So as a comparison, let me read you the King James Version. "The king's daughter is all glorious within. Her clothing is of wrought gold. She shall be brought unto the king in raiment of needlework. The virgins, her companions that follow her, shall be brought unto thee." So there's a big difference between these two. Sidney's political inclinations are really shown towards the Queen. she directly references the queen. Instead, in the King James translation, we see the king's daughter is the word there. And keep in mind that was written only 20 years after Mary Sidney did her translations. She also really focuses on the queen's garments. So the queen is assumed to be Elizabeth, and she shines not only in her upper garment, but her underclothes. So that's a reference to Elizabeth's divine blessing and political achievements. So she's shining inside and out. Her insides are golden and pure. Her elaborate clothing is golden and pure. And those golden insides also are revealing that purity and innocence of the Virgin Queen and her faith to God. So as that benevolent Virgin Queen, she illustrated that women could effectively hold traditional male authority with the blessing of God. So God's stamp of approval on devout women could easily be translated to Mary Sidney's own authority to translate the Psalms. So if God approved of Elizabeth's rule of the entire nation, surely then Mary Sidney could be entrusted to communicate his word to a larger audience. And in the King James Version, the word queen is pointedly lowercase. So even then, he is kind of demoting that role of queen in the King James Version. And the king character is much more focused on. So that was just an example from there of how those translations work in comparisons with others of the time. So to wrap up, Sidney really demonstrated that Queen Elizabeth and devout Protestant women like her were able to accurately and expertly communicate God's word. And in the Queen's case, were able to lead a nation with God's blessing, the male blessing. So with that blessing and with Sidney's work with the translation, slowly breaking down those barriers, women were able to enact some form of agency. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Lydia. And now we get to hear from Anna Catarino.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. So in 1511 and 1512, Henry VIII passed the first attempts at regularizing Britain's medical structure. And these excluded women from practicing medicine along with smiths and weavers, saying that they were practicing dangerously and putting at risk the health of the English. Now, this caused in 1518 the creation of the Royal College of Physicians in order to have an establishment that would somehow regulate medicine even more. The Royal College of Physicians received the Royal Charter in 1523. This did not, however, solve any of the problems that Henry VIII wanted to resolve, to the point that in 1542, he actually had to pass another medical act, which was known as the Bucks Charter, in which he allowed women to practice medicine again, but they had to do it for charity, so they could not ask money. After this, the situation became much more complicated, to the point that no one actually knew what was the law and what wasn't. Mary I tried to repeal the Second Medical Act, but it was never passed by Parliament. So the Royal College of Physicians, which was already verging on becoming a more political structure, started to drag female physicians to court. And it is within this context that Oswald de Denswell takes place. The main character of Oswald de Denswell is Helen. She's the daughter of a physician. She does not have a rank. She does not have wealth to support her unorthodox practices, and yet this idea places her in the space between old wives, which were also known as herb women. For the most of it, they worked in brothels, and noble women who obviously had to have a medical training because it was required by household manuals. Now, the description of Helen within the play actually references physicians such as Catherine Clark, who was dragged to court and admitted the deed but denied the name, and Margaret Kennings, who practiced in London at the end of the 16th century. Helen is also said to be a doctor she, so the title is given to her at court and she's allowed to heal the king. And this royal endorsement actually mirrors the royal endorsement that Margaret Kennings had received, although Margaret Kennings was then forced to shut down her practice despite royal intervention, with a series of letters between the Royal College of Physicians and Sir Francis Walsingham, in which the Royal College of Physicians describes her practices as dangerous, whereas Queen Elizabeth and Sir mother, Frances Walsingham, say that she was actually practicing for charity without asking money in return. And the same is said about Helen. Furthermore, Helen is also said to have learned the practice from her father, which is also something that connects her to the Dr. Shees of the period. We have female irregulars who actually inherited prescription recipes and then went on to use them. So if it is, within this social context and within this idea of medical diatribes, which see, on the one hand, learned authentic fellows, as the play describes them, so people who belong to the Royal College of Physicians, who had a degree from Oxford and Cambridge, and on the other hand, we have women who actually learned it from their fathers and then went on practicing, as it will also continue throughout the centuries. For example, at the end of the 17th century, we have Mary Trier with a Medicatrix, in which she actually accuses the Royal College of Physicians of grave incompetence and dangerous practices. So it is within this social phenomena that the play takes place, and it also allows the play to create the structure of healing, which will eventually lead to the play's conclusion.
Thank you very much, Anna. That was great. And now we're lucky enough to hear from Jennifer Shope.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Okay. Okay. Are you able to see my presentation?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I will make it larger. Okay. All right. All right, so tonight I'm going to, or today, depending on where you are, I'm going to talk about domesticating and reclaiming the whore. And this is based on a paper I wrote years ago as an undergrad, actually, in which I was looking at how Restoration era actresses used portraiture to domesticate their image. And for purposes of this presentation today, I wanted to compare it to how performers in the US today utilize contemporary forms of media to tackle their image in society. And over time, we see female agency increase, but at the same time, the different forms of media have changed and societal expectations have changed as well. So I've placed some select Restoration actresses side by side with current present day actresses to show imagery. So first I have Nell Gwyn. Nell Gwyn was a Restoration era actress in the 17th century. And unfortunately at the time, even though it was the first time that women could grace the English stages, they also faced a lot of issues of prostitution. And even though their reputation was considered loose, there was some truth to it, because in order to ironically avoid unwanted advances from men on the stage as objects, they actually had to have protection from men, which would involve having sexual relations with men. And Nell was tied with Charles II, who brought back the theater and restored the crown in England at this time. You can see from this portrait that Charles II wanted to be made for his pleasure alone, that we have Nell in her full sort of sexual glory, but we do have some elements of domesticity in the form of their illegitimate child, Charles, as seen here, and some soft domestic imagery and mythological references in the background as well. Now, keep in mind, this was only meant for Charles's pleasure. But then we hearken to 2004 with Janet Jackson and the famous Super Bowl Nipplegate incident, in which Janet Jackson, a performer who is known for, at this time in the early 2000s, sexualized music videos and songs and reclaiming sexuality as a form of female power. We have here the obvious gaze of Justin Timberlake watching, but there were millions of people watching the Super Bowl incident at the time. Even though her boob was only actually exposed for 9/16 of a second, we can see that nowadays we can Google this image like I did and find it and have more viewers. Now, the problem with with Janet as well with Nell is they both were sort of didn't really have a whole lot of agency in what was going on. Janet in particular, afterward her career did suffer. The president of CBS, Les Moonves, did not enjoy her presentation, did not think that it was appropriate, even though it was considered a wardrobe malfunction. And subsequently her career started to falter, even though Justin Timberlake's did not. Now we have two women who actually went in a different direction, trying to desexualize themselves. We have Charlotte Shark of the early 18th century. We see a photo here, or excuse me, a portrait here of when she was 4 years old, in her father's male attire, but she just did not stop here. She also went on to be an actress of the stage who performed breeches parts, which meant she performed male parts on the stage. But she didn't just do it for the stage. She also, as an adult woman, was known to go by the name of Mr. Brown and walk the streets with a big silver hat and pretend to be a man, and to be both father and mother to her daughter. Now, at the time, this would be considered very outrageous and scandalous. And her reasons for cross-dressing could have been that she enjoyed it. We do not know, or she did it as a form of protection because her husband really wasn't around as husbands should be. So hearken now to fast forward to 2016 with Hillary Clinton, which I call the pantsuit run for president. And here she's, at the mercy of people all across the world analyzing her. Why is she, dressing as a man would? But if you think about it, A, she might just like pantsuits, but secondarily, she's also the first female in the US to get this far for president in a position that was otherwise held by men. Now, please keep in mind, 2016 was also the time that the Me Too movement became very globalized, and with the Harvey Weinstein situation. So again, here are two women trying to downplay female sexuality. And then last but not least, I have two women who really took the bull by the horns to try to really look at their images from a domestic and a career perspective. We have Sarah Siddons in the 18th century who really worked with painters to soften her image. She wanted to have nothing to do with any form of sexuality. And you can see by this cloud-like ethereal image of her as tragic muse that she wanted to be taken seriously, and in fact played the role of Hamlet many times, and even did Lady Macbeth while 5 months pregnant. And then we move to the future of Beyonce in 2017, a performer also known as Queen Bee, and you can see her here on her floral throne. We're hearkening back in a way to the Nell Gwynn photo of the 17th century of a woman who's very sexualized with a child present. And here, Beyonce chose to do a series of photos that she tweeted out to her fans to let them know that she was pregnant with twins. The difference between the Nell Gwynn photo and here is that she chose to do this. Her husband, Jay-Z, did not make her do this. But what I want to acknowledge is going through to sum up here, going through these images from the 17th to the 18th and now to the 21st century, it's interesting to look at the objectification of women on the stage and how these women over time utilize other forms of media, social media, portraiture, and photographs to show female agency, to reclaim their sexuality. But I leave you with this note, is as we move into the future and media now opens it up to the public with social media being so widespread, how much female agency or human agency do we actually have when at the end of the day, the people who are actually gazing at this, the users of social media, have the final say of canceling a person or accepting them? Thank you so much for your time.
Cheers. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That was quickening. And finally, Martina Giuzzetti, it's your chance. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the way women were represented in British feminist text from the 17th to the 18th century and the kind of discourses around them. And as you can see, the corpus was quite small, and it includes only 3 texts from the 17th century and 3 texts from the 18th century. And the choice to focus on such a small group of texts allowed me to delve deeper into the linguistic analysis. And usually Mary Astor and Mary Wollstonecraft are best remembered as cases of early examples of feminism in Britain, but all other authors, which you can see here, might be defined as feminist, given the contents and aims of the writings, and as you can imagine, just by reading the titles of their text. So I looked at the way the word woman is used in this text, and the aim was to find what kind of discourses were typical in this genre, which can be said to be defenses of women. And I identified 3 main discourses, and I'm just going to provide a few examples for each of them. So first of all, the theme of education, which is of key importance because it is shared by all authors throughout these 2 centuries, but we can see some differences because in the 17th century, the authors used the phrase educated or learned women to refer to mainly to examples from the past, illustrious examples from the past. Whereas in the 18th century, the learned women is, there's a reference to the future. So hopefully, according to Mary Robinson, in half a century, there would be lots of women in university. And the second important difference is that educated women were thought to be beneficial for their relations in the 17th century, especially for husbands, as you can see in the example from Macon. Whereas in the 18th century, Mary Robinson says that probably these educated women would not be so beneficial for their husbands in an ironical way, obviously. Like she says here, a learned woman does not flatter his self-love. Then the second theme is this dichotomy between silliness and wisdom. And we should remember, first of all, that silly and foolish are used here in the 16th and 17th century with a different meaning, because the meaning, according also to the Oxford English Dictionary, was that of defenseless and helpless. And we see again an important difference. In the 17th century, we have more condescending tones towards these silly or foolish women, whereas in the 18th century, Mary Wollstonecraft uses very harsh tones towards foolish women, as you can see, especially in the second example. It is your own conduct, or your foolish women, which throws an odium on your sex. And we know that Mary Wollstonecraft was also very often criticized as not really being feminist because of these chiding tones. And finally, we also have the theme of the recommended behavior, the best behavior a woman should have in public. In the 17th century, Margaret Fell speaks of the fact that men think that women should keep silence in church, so do not say anything basically regarding religious matters. But then she justifies, she defenses women speaking in church by saying, those that speak against the woman speaking speak against the Church of Christ. And in the 18th century, authors talked about modest and immodest women, but again, the decorous conduct is actually seen in a more negative way. It is actually seen as being bad for women. Again, Mary Wollstonecraft says, the life of a modest woman is reduced by our absurd institution to a perpetual conflict with herself. So it is being modest is more a prison than actually a good quality, according to Mary Wollstonecraft. And to draw some very brief conclusions, we have seen how the main theme was that of education, which was considered as to be of key importance. And we see how the tones become harsher and harsher towards silly or foolish women, especially in the 18th century. We've also seen these changing views on modesty. And on the whole, we could say that there is a growing impatience with the status quo if we see this difference between the 17th and 18th century. And we should remember that British feminism, or what is also known as the first wave of feminism, starts around the 1850s, and Wollstonecraft publishes a vindication at the end of the 1700s. So this is it, and thank you for your attention.
Oh, thank you. That was great. Thank you very much. I think we should give everyone just a minute to collect their thoughts and to congratulate our lightning round speakers. So thank you very much. Yes, and I would like to thank everyone. I mean, these are quickening, and I think we can see, I mean, the great strength of the lightning round, because as far as I can tell, in the past less than a half hour, we've covered at least 5 centuries and more than a half dozen forms or genres. So I think this is astonishing breadth, right? And what happens when we put this sort of diversity, diversity of perspective and diversity of historical moment into conversation with one another? I think we can get a lot of quickening and interesting questions. And so I ask anyone in the audience who's interested, please just put your name in the chat and we will call on you. And I want to start, this question is for anyone and perhaps everyone on the panel. And it's about a phrase from Anna's paper. Anna was discussing a female doctor in the 16th century who was charged with practicing medicine. And she admitted to the deed, but denied the name. And I think this is a really interesting rhetorical, ethical, and political position to occupy. And it seems to correspond in certain ways with a position we see repeated. So something like Mary Sidney. Mary Sidney's somewhat defensive translation or refusal to be defensive translation of the sonnets, or not the sonnet, the Psalms. So the idea that, oh, I can do a good job, I can do it, I'll do the deed without admitting anything about the weakness of my gender and so on. So I was wondering if our speakers could speak to this idea, perhaps starting with Anna, about admitting the deed but denying the name as a strategy for dealing with or coping with a patriarchal and largely misogynistic culture.
Okay, so I think in light of the medical diatribes, it was an advantage to say I can practice medicine, but I'm not a physician, because practicing medicine for a woman was actually required. So she had to have the knowledge, and obviously the woman was the one who healed members of the family. So extending that knowledge to the neighbors, let's say, or friends, that was still, practicing medicine, but they could, let's say, use patriarchal values against the patriarchy, in the sense that they were required to have those skills. So that was, the fault to begin with. It was actually something that was expected of them. So in a way, one could not go against, let's say, manuals like Markham's, for example. And I think that was actually, that's an interesting perspective. I mean, where you just say, I've learned this and I can use it, and you made me learn it. So, I mean, they did not consider themselves doctors, obviously, but they did have the knowledge, and everyone else believed them to be more competent than doctors, because they learned from manual surgery, they learned physics, but they also learned not to use empirical observation, but run tests and trials. So everyone, including the gentry, believed them to be superior.
Interesting. Interesting. Lydia, I noticed you nodding when I mentioned the Psalms. So I was wondering if you could speak maybe about the strategy for authorizing yourself in translation that Mary Sidney uses.
Yeah, I have a couple different Psalm quotes and stuff that I pulled in my paper. And what I noticed, what was really interesting that Mary Sidney will do is sometimes I like to refer to it as almost like a masculine sense of assertion. So she does try to take on this like traditionally male role of being assertive and questioning in some of the Psalms, which I think I guess I would say improves her power as the psalmist and the writer. And she questions God sometimes in these psalms, and she says, "Who did know me, whom I did know, removed by thee, are gone from me, are gone. Lord, why dost thou reject my soul and hide thy face from me?" So she directly does question God in her translations, and I think that that also further gives her this sense of agency, this self-reference, without, as you mentioned, directly asserting, or admitting that women have like some faults or a lesser status. So there's a lot of like clever things that she does within her sonnets, and she also is very careful to follow the line of like individual salvation through learning and interpreting the Bible by oneself. So there's a very direct connection with God that I think highlights this sense of self-assertion and claiming status and claiming I guess power in a way where women can be on an equal level in the eyes of God, and she's very careful with that. But I found it really interesting that she can insert such subtle things in there, but when you read it later on, you can tell what she was going for. It's very interesting.
And Jennifer, I'm just thinking of yours. I mean, I think the sort of pattern here, that equivocation, that wiggliness, that necessary wiggliness to both assert agency and deny it. I think that we see that. I mean, we see it in Martina's presentation and a lot of those treatises where, I mean, obviously Mary Wollstonecraft is perhaps more full-throated than previous writers, right? And just asserting the right. But Jennifer, in your presentation, we see a pretty unself-conscious gestures of self-presentation. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, I mean, not that they should be ashamed, but that shamelessness, that empowered shamelessness, perhaps.
It's interesting because Nell Gwynn actually did say, I know that I'm a whore, and did have quite a few men named Charles that she dated. But that's just what she did. I mean, she went from a lowly barmaid to an orange girl to now, an actress, and what I find interesting is that, finally women can be on the stage. I mean, that's a huge thing. We talk about centuries and centuries of women throughout the West, just not allowed on the stage, and they finally get it. And then with it comes this idea of you're weak. There's your temptation to the flesh, but but are they really, or is it just that men who are gazing realize that they are tempted and just assume that women feel the same way? And I just thought it was interesting how these women on the stage were objectified and thought, like Sarah Siddons did in the 18th century, oh, if I make myself go from a 3-dimensional object to a 2-dimensional object in a portrait, maybe that will help show me in a different light. And I just, given the 21st century perspective that we had, it just seemed like an early form of social media, that what we do now is we put our best selves out there and we don't see our full selves on social media. We only curate our image. And I just thought these women were doing it back then, either because a man told them to, in the case of Nell Gwynn, or in the case of Sarah, who really did work with male painters, of course, to craft her image.
Sure. Yeah, I think that comparison to social media is fascinating. I was thinking of Twitter today when Marlon was discussing epigrams. I mean, just a bunch of dudes sitting around saying pithy things briefly and not taking questions. But Jim, Kearney has a question.
First of all, thanks everyone. That was a wonderful lightning round, and it really did feel as if all of these ideas were coming so fast and furious. It was fantastic. So, I guess I also have a question that's along the lines of Andrew's, and it's sort of for everyone. These pieces are so different that people would take this question up differently. But one of the ways we think about voice, or what we're talking about when we talk about voice, is coming from a particular perspective, or representing a particular lived experience, or having texture, all of those things. And one of our, I don't think of it as a fantasy necessarily, but one of our desires when we look back at earlier texts is to find those voices, to hear that voice, right? But in all of these pieces, in different ways, we have the kind of navigation of a voice in this larger patriarchal structure, right? Where you have to erase the voice, you have to anonymize the voice. There are things you have to do. You have to have a kind of, you have to ventriloquize to a certain extent to say what you want to say. And I guess my question has to do with that texture and that particularity, and whether in these different pieces, and anyone could pick this up, I suppose, you found that, right? Maybe in translation, you can hear Mary Sidney's voice, or even as Elizabeth puts on this particular persona that is so obviously sort of so oriented toward the state and the body politic. Nonetheless, we can hear the particularity of that voice. Anyway, that was my big dumb question.
I can answer that and sort of
Please, your feet.
connect to Andrew's question about calling the position or the deed by name. So first of all, I think that Elizabeth had no problem to call the deed by its name. She had a lot of names for the position. She was king, she was queen, she was a prince, she was everything she needed to be. What she had a problem with is calling her body by name. And I think she was the body, the female body, not the body holiday. She was reluctant to use her body as a female body. And she was constantly trying to refer to her body in other means, in abstract means. So in like, I'm soul and not a body, I'm head and not a body, I'm everything but a body.
Interesting.
Because she really had a problem with using the feminine body as a commodity. What used to happen back then is queens, what you would require of a queen is obviously to produce an heir. It doesn't matter if the queen was actually a monarch or, or wife of. In any case, she was put in this position. So in her case, it was very complicated because I'm the king, but I'm also the queen, which means I'm the monarch, but I'm also expected to fulfill the job of the queen and also produce the next king. And she really didn't want to be in that place. So that was the thing that she would not name. And therefore, as I said as I mentioned in my talk earlier, the term mater, there's a very long speech from 1963 in which she keeps saying matter, this weighty matter, this important matter, but she never says what the matter is. She wouldn't say marriage, she wouldn't say succession, she wouldn't say body. So that was the thing that she wouldn't mention. Not the job. It seems like she was perfectly fine with the job, but not with the consequences of being a woman or a female in this job. And I think when it comes to a voice, it's very interesting because Elizabeth wrote her speeches. Now, that wasn't very common. Even other kings and monarchs and queens usually would let their secretaries write the speeches. And the speaker would then deliver the speeches in parliament. Not because they couldn't write a speech or couldn't deliver a speech. It's just they had no interest in wasting time in parliament. But she was the first one who not only wrote the speeches, but insisted on delivering many of them in parliament. She was the first woman who actually delivered a speech in parliament. I mean, that's quite huge for that time because women were not allowed to be in parliament. Even queens did not attend parliament. So I think in that sense, voicing women, she really changed things in that way. And she did that not because I don't think she was a feminist in the modern sense of the word, but she wanted to make sure that she's saying what she wants to say She didn't want people to alter her words. She didn't want other people to say something different than what she wanted to say. She wanted to make sure she has control on the message.
Mm-hmm.
And she also wanted to make sure that they see her and hear her. And that's important. The visual aspect, visibility. She wanted to be there because she thought that they will understand her better if they see her. So she wasn't like covering herself. She wasn't like running away from this kind of thing. She was always present in multiple ways, just not as a female body.
I love the idea of that matter that doesn't speak itself, that matter. And I also wonder too, I mean, mater, right? The Latin for mother. I mean, so we have that, her attempt to eschew materiality by drawing attention to her motherness. Marlon, it's time for your question.
Hi, thanks to everyone. This was really exciting and interesting. I do love the format, and every contribution was fantastic. My question is for Jennifer. I noticed that 3 of the images that you show present the sitter for the portrait as a goddess. Sarah Siddons is the tragic muse. Nell Gwynn is presented as Venus because little Charles has his Cupid wings, and there's a couple of doves over in the background. And Beyonce's pose with one hand across the breasts and the other between her legs is reminiscent, very evocative of Botticelli's Birth of Venus. And in the Nell Gwynn and the Beyonce, so you've got both of those women represented as Venus and as a reproductive body. And this, comes off Yafit's discussion. Both of them are represented as eroticized maternal bodies. And so I wonder if you could talk about a little about this kind of divine element as it relates to the other kinds of cultural positions that you have charted out.
Thank you, Marlon, for kind of putting all that together. It's hard to capture everything so quickly. I was afraid I was going over time, but I love, thank you for kind of fleshing that out. And I think what's interesting is particularly going back to the Restoration era that, there was this real shroud of immorality around actresses, and not even just actresses, but also actors, this idea of just that the church being at odds, which was interesting because we had this long stretch of time where that the church really utilized theater during the medieval to do pageantry and to do the resurrection, the crucifixion. And then we move into this era where theater is now, a professional thing once again, like it was before. And we have this idea of like, now it's this like contrast to religion. It's not in conjunction or connected. And I just think it's really interesting to think about how using kind of religious kind of or mythological sort of imagery can sort of help soften sort of an idea that feels like something is icky or sticky. And I just think it also just goes back to this old notion of Madonna or whore. You have to be one or the other. And I feel like, well, why can't we be both or more than that? So I feel like everything always comes back to this idea. And we see this in various cultures, even, in India, this idea of the Kama Sutra and the Hinduism sort of going together, this idea of religion and sexuality being far apart, but so many religions are about reproductive bodies, this need to reproduce. And so why are things at odds? So I think the imagery often brings these things together. So I think it makes sense that these women would want to bring together those things that are often that seem like they're in contrast or in conflict with each other, really are connected and showing the complexity of womanhood through the imagery. That's how I see it.
And so you're suggesting that the pagan resonances are particularly useful in that regard.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you.
I hate to do this because this panel has been so lively and there's still so much going on, but I'd like to give everyone a bit of a break for 4 minutes. And then we're coming back in just a few to hear from Jim Kearney, who will summarize everything that has been said over the past 2 days.
Well, you know, Andrew, I am not going to summarize, and I could probably sort of, rather than have a break and come back, I could probably just say what I'm going to say now.
That would be great. That would be great, Jim.
All right. Well, you know, thank you. It's my great honor to bring this year's EMC conference to a close. It has been a blast. Thank you all for joining in, for being game, for making your voices heard. So founded by Patty Fumerton many years ago now, the Early Modern Center, you know, it's designed to support a community of scholars and students. And this annual conference is always a celebration of community, right? Forging intellectual connections, creating conversational spaces, seeing old friends, making new ones. Our theme this year, Voicing Woman Across Media, 1500 to 1800, it's proven, you know, wonderfully capacious, you know, polyvocal, polymorphous, polytemporal. We've traced voices across historical periods and art forms, gendered positions and possibilities. We've revisited fraught and horrific histories of violence and misogyny, thought about what it might mean to repurpose or escape or refuse these histories that haunt and harm us. We've listened to voices in and across media forms and archives with special attention to print history, ballads, ephemera, television and film, technologies and histories of media and remediation. Some singular figures have crossed our virtual stage: Sarah Scott and Mary Sidney, Mal Flanders and Anne Finch, Juno and Elizabeth I, Diane Dugow and Scheherazade, and my personal favorite, Margaret. We've addressed voices in terms of race and nation, identity and sexuality, and we've touched on transatlantic work, urban markets and gendered economies, the incredible job qualifications demanded of wet nurses. We've considered the power of the tongue, unruly rhetorics, voices speaking otherwise. And we've attended to the art of care, queered archives, trans identities and voices, disability knowledges, temporal drag, and temporal messiness. I have to confess that my voice, you know, sounds a little strange to me as I make these closing remarks. Properly, this should be Patty Fumerton's place, the founder of the EMC, its current director. Patty, as many of you know, has a voice, you know, in all the metaphorical richness of that term. She has a voice like no other. I think we missed that voice the past couple of days, but we've certainly felt her design and her labor and her presence, and I can sort of hear her voice right now telling me to move it along, so I will. But first, there are a couple of people to thank. We need to thank friends new and old, friends who came up, metaphorically speaking, from LA and Orange County, or down from the Bay Area and the Pacific Northwest, or those who joined us from Pennsylvania and Michigan and New York, and especially those who navigated, you know, sometimes very significant time zone challenges. So from Leicestershire and London, Padua and Cyprus, from Turkey and Milan, Israel and India, an amazing collection of voices. And we need to thank our keynote speakers, Simone Chess and Jim McNamara, for their wonderful contributions to this, you know, larger conversation, and for giving us so much to think about and take back with us as we, you know, head back to our lives. This is a graduate organized conference, and I need to thank our intrepid grads who have done so much work behind the scenes. This includes Reem Taha, Sean Nowicki, Liv Henderson, and Olivia Bienvenue. And I need to thank our fearless leader, the graduate fellow for the EMC this year, our conference organizer, Nicole Stark. Could we give all of them a virtual round of applause? And anyone, final thoughts?
I'll pop in. Thank you so much, Jim, for that wonderful send-off, and thank you to everyone that's in our final panel and who's presented and just come to participate and come to just take it all in. And thank you to just the EMC broadly for just all your flexibility and teamwork, and the fact that it takes a village to put this conference together every time we do it. And everyone has so much alacrity for doing it. This has been a great year with wonderful keynotes and fantastic moderation and wonderful presentations. And I really have appreciated everything. And I'm glad we had our conference back this year. So thank you all.
It's great to be back. Thank you, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. It really is great to be back.
All right, if no one else has anything to add, I guess that is the end of the conference. Have a fantastic weekend, everybody. Thank you all. And thanks so much
for
Nicole.
everything.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.